My name is Michael Goldberg, and I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve. And I also am an associate professor teaching entrepreneurship at Weatherhead School of Management. So it's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces today for our discussion with Sarah Morgenstern. All of these sessions that we do as part of our entrepreneurship speaker series are student moderated. So we're thrilled to have Aditi, who's going to be our moderator today. We encourage participation. So Aditi will be running the show, so you can let her know either in the chat or if you're on Facebook, put in the Facebook chat and we'll bring your questions in, and then you can ask Sarah the questions directly or through Aditi. So that's great. Sarah is an old friend of mine. We're both big Clevelanders and Cleveland sports fans, as she's got her LeBron block in the background, which I appreciate.
I'm not just trying to cater to you guys. I promise you, this is my standard go-to wake up in the morning, start with LeBron look.
I thought you'd rotate between the block, the shot, and the stop. Those were my three favorites instead of the drive or the fumble. My least favorites. I'm going with the Cleveland Municipal Stadium Gate A. At least I know Howard Bobrow probably attended there. So Sarah's an old friend. She'll talk about her background today. We know each other through the small world of sort of Clevelanders and family, but we both attended the same grad schools, not at the same time. And I've been really inspired by the work that Sarah's been doing around impact investing, and I've been threatening to get her to Cleveland because she is back here in front of students, and we've never quite figured out a time. So today is the first, which is I hope of many times that we get you back in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve engaging with our students. So Sarah, thank you for doing this today. And I'll flip it over to Aditi, who will run the show for us.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. I'm so excited for the conversation, and right back at you guys. Really admire all the work that you've been doing around this topic and the energy that you're bringing to it. So look forward to the conversation.
Great.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldberg. Hi, everyone. My name is Aditi Deshmukh. I'm a recent graduate of the MSM Finance program. I did my undergraduate at Case as well in biology and biochemistry. And after the summer, I'll be finishing my master's in public health from Cleveland State University. I have the pleasure to have the conversation with our speaker today, Sarah Morgenstern. Sarah is an impact investor along with being a principal at Flourish Ventures. But most importantly, she's a native of Cleveland. So Sarah, if you could please introduce yourself and tell us more about your background, schooling, and leadership journey that led you to Flourish.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Aditi. And my story peaks very early, which in fact is that I'm a Clevelander with my 216 phone right here. And this was very good. You guys forced me to put on professional garb today. This actually felt like sort of a prom dress compared to the hoodies that I've been in for 2 months. So I appreciate the chance to show up. So as Aditi mentioned, I'm from Cleveland originally, went to Shaker Heights High School. My parents growing up, my dad was actually an early stage venture lawyer, worked with Howard, and my mom was a nonprofit consultant. And so from a very early age have been sort of interested in how those two worlds mesh together and multi-sector problem solving generally. I was a history major in college, thought I was going to be a straight shot to law school. But after I graduated, I got really intrigued by China's geopolitical rise and sort of thought, man, this is a really good time to go live somewhere else and learn another language. When else am I going to be able to do that? So I moved to China. I lived in China for 3 years. I spent a year up in Dalian, which is an industrial seaport town sort of right across from South Korea. And then 2 years in Beijing. It was an exceptional time to be in Beijing. It was right before the Olympics. So there was this real palpable sense of energy and sort of this coming out party atmosphere. And I worked for APCO, which was an investment and government relations firm there. And so we're advising multinationals that were new to the Chinese market on their market entry strategies and their government relations, et cetera. And so that experience really reoriented me towards business as, an engine of geopolitics worldwide. So coming off of that, I came back to the States and I followed Professor Goldberg's footsteps, and I enrolled in the Wharton Seiss program, and so did that sort of combination of finance and economics. And if you squinted, you could start to see a through line in my life, which was this notion of, how markets and policy interact. And then went to McKinsey and was there for 4 years. And at McKinsey, did a lot of corporate finance on the one hand, and then served a number of nonprofit clients. So higher ed institutes, nonprofit hospitals, and in a consulting context, that was a reasonably schizophrenic set of interests. And so when it dawned on me that impact investing was carving out this intersection between, hey, functionally, I really love finance and I love investing. That's what I get intellectually excited about. But I'd love to do it with a mission orientation. And so started to really explore the world of impact investing. And when I say impact investing, it's a big tent, right? It's a term that covers a lot of territory. And so generally speaking, it's sort of loosely people who are investing intentionally, trying to generate some sort of positive social impact and intend to measure that, right? So when I say impact investing, so much fits under that. So I looked at lots of different forms of impact investing. There's being an equity investor, or there's doing debt and lending. There's very early stage investing. So 2 gals in a garage, which is the stage that I ended up landing on. And there's public markets, ESG investing, right? And everything in between. There's vertical specific shops that just do education or financial services or sustainability versus generalists. So lots and lots of flavors of what impact investing means. I was really drawn to the Omidyar network for a couple of reasons. And maybe just by way of background, so you all know, Omidyar network, Pierre Omidyar, who was the founder of eBay, this was his global philanthropic investment fund that was set up back in 2004 and really was a pioneer in the impact investing space. And the notion of how to use for-profit investing and nonprofit grant making in a complementary fashion in order to drive sector level change. So Omidyar Network worked across a bunch of different areas. There was a government and citizen engagement team, a property rights team, a financial services team. And I joined the financial services team. And in part, I was just so drawn to the notion of, hey, any deeply entrenched social problem worth its salt has a public, private, and social sector component. And what a tremendous luxury to have a toolkit, both for-profit and nonprofit, that you could use to try and make a contribution to that. And then I also really wanted to work domestically. I'd done Seiss and had this international orientation and was coming out of China, but it was post the financial crisis. And so I was really thinking about, what does impact investing look like in our own backyard, right? In Cleveland, Ohio, in Detroit, in Kansas. How do we put this to work here? So I joined the Omidyar Network 4 years ago to work on their financial services team, specifically to help refresh the US investment strategy, and then stuck around for the next 4 years to implement against that mandate. And then a year ago, and this is where it gets a little confusing, so forgive me for this, the financial services team from the Omidyar Network, we spun out. Probably better described as spinning in place, because it was the same team with the same funder, with the same mission, working at the same cubicle, but we're now called Flourish Ventures. So I'm currently at Flourish, and Aditi, I know that was I'm happy to answer any questions about that sort of meandering journey. Otherwise, we'll transition to sharing about Flourish and what we do there.
No, I think that's a great transition. If you could just emphasize more about the Flourish story, and also specifically in terms of impact, what you were looking into, and kind of how you guys initiate change at your venture capital fund.
Perfect, that's great. So Flourish is Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, his global evergreen fund focused on financial health and economic prosperity. We're a $500 million facility. So when we spun out from the Omidyar Network, we ported over $200 million of existing commitments. And then Pierre doubled down on the space with an incremental $300 million. We have 18 investment professionals around the globe. We've got boots on the ground in India, in Africa, and Latin America. So we are quite global and international in nature. But about 50% of our work is focused on the US, which is where I focus my attention. And the jumping off point for everything we do in the US is, hey, 70% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, struggle with financial health. That was true even in a pre-coronavirus environment. It's obviously only been exacerbated by the tumult that has unfolded over the last quarter, right? But the core notion that the majority of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck has been true for a while here. And so that's the umbrella thesis for everything we do. Against that mandate, 90% of our work is early stage, for-profit, commercial return-driven investing, largely seed through Series B, and we can come back to some of that as helpful. And we're really looking for technology-enabled solutions that help mass market consumers up and down the income spectrum to either become more financially resilient or build their net worth. That's the outcome that we want to help families with. And against that, we actually behave a lot like sort of mission-driven fintech investors, right? We really do invest in the full suite of financial service products. So mobile banking tools, lending tools, insurance tools, retirement savings. When I say sort of fintech, those are the subcategories underneath that we invest against. And I'm happy, Aditi, to share more about our portfolio and some of the specific companies. When we invest in for-profit companies, we want them to be wildly successful in their own right, but we also invest in specific themes that we hope can sort of provide a demonstration effect and nudge the system in a positive direction. So for example, we've made bets across the globe in mobile banks, where there's no brick and mortar branches, right? So you're eliminating that whole cost structure and everything is distributed over the mobile phone. And that's something we've invested in the US, in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in India, right? So we tend to invest around themes. So 90% of our work is for-profit investing. 10% of our work is grant making. And we use our grants for consumer research, for measurement tools, and for policy engagement. You know, we recognize that financial services is a well-defined sector with regulators and consumer advocates and a whole set of ecosystem actors that are really important to shaping the overall narrative. And so that's how we use our grant dollars. So that's the operating model at the highest level in terms of the for-profit investing and the nonprofit grant making. I thought it might be helpful to go into more detail about a couple of our for-profit companies to give you a flavor for them and a couple of our grants just to sort of illustrate this high-level jargon. Does that feel like a useful next direction?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah? Okay. Mm-hmm. So in our for-profit investing, you know, one of our observations about fintech, there's been a surge in investment in fintech in the US over the last decade. But when you look at where those dollars go, they're very disproportionately focused on upper middle income millennials at the expense of sort of everybody else, right? And so we're really interested in personal finance tools that help overlooked consumer segments. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One is a company called Propel. So the story behind Propel is there are 40 million people in the US on food stamps. It's 1 in 7 US households. And food stamps get dispersed on electronic benefit transfer cards that sort of look like your JP Morgan Chase banking card, but don't come with any of the features that you take for granted on a standard banking card. And most particularly, it's really hard to check your balance. Right? So imagine your food stamps come on the 1st of the month. Now it's the 17th. You're going into the grocery store. You're trying to figure out, do you have enough money left to buy the carton of milk? And the only way to know that is to either call a 1-800 number or to sort of do the math yourself, right? So the founder of Propel, a wonderful entrepreneur named Jimmy Chen, who was coming out of Facebook, very much sort of equipped with the Silicon Valley playbook, was really interested in how you could use the mobile phone in order to enhance the experience of being on food stamps. And so he started by actually just doing a lot of customer ride-alongs. We find that our best entrepreneurs are ones who spend an intense amount of time with their customers to really suss out what are the pain points here, and let's build for those, right? So Jimmy would go on shopping trips with folks who were on SNAP, the food stamp program, and he noticed this issue around checking balances. So what they did was they created a mobile app that just allows you to instantly check your balance, right? It's pulling from a data set that already existed at the state level, but that folks weren't taking advantage of. And the app has proven tremendously popular and grown extremely quickly. So they launched 2 years ago. They now have more than 3 million monthly active users, which in fintech land sort of qualifies as J-curve-like growth, which is to say it's really taken off very quickly. It's, I think, a testament to how when you focus on overlooked consumer segments that lots of entrepreneurs aren't building for, you can identify pain points that may sound simple, but actually make a pretty meaningful dent in people's lives and reducing stress. They've done studies with Harvard that have demonstrated that people who use Propel are able to extend their food stamps by up to 2 days per month. So it's materially changing how they budget and choose to shop on a day-to-day basis. And then on the back of that relationship, they're doing lots of other things to help folks with their financial challenges. So they offer discounts at grocery stores to help drive down that cost. There's a job board that helps to connect people with other sources of employment. And then in COVID, and as we talk through the portfolio companies, I'll try and share with you some of the things that they're doing specifically in response to what's unfolded over the last couple of months. A huge proportion of their users have experienced drops in income over the last couple of months, whether it's because they lost their job altogether or because they're hourly workers who have had their hours cut back. And so they teamed up with a nonprofit called Give Directly for something called Project 100. And the goal of Project 100 was to raise $100 million so that they could give $1,000 to as many of their users as possible as cash grants, right? There's been a real premium placed on just getting getting money into folks' hands as fast as possible. So they've raised over $50 million so far and are dispersing that, and it's making an incredibly important impact on people's lives in real time. And I think has been a really impressive, inspiring example of how a for-profit startup is able to leverage its technology in a time of need in order to do something really different and innovative. So that's Propel. Should I do a couple other for-profits? Is that?
Yeah, that way we would get a more diversified view of the company itself, so for sure.
Okay, terrific. So same vein, personal finance for overlooked consumer segments. There's a company called Steady, which is based out of Atlanta. And the idea with Steady is, hey, a large number of Americans, actually almost 40%, generate some kind of supplementary income. And people look for supplementary income streams for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's because they're chronically underemployed, and so they're looking for that extra sort of 10 hours a week that they need in order to be able to meet their expense demands. Sometimes they might have an emergency expense arise, right? So you get in a car accident and your car's banged up, and so you need to come up with $500. Sometimes it's just you've got a kid who's got a birthday and you want to buy him something special, right? So lots of different reasons that people look for supplementary work. There's no good way to go see what are my choices? What are the jobs out there, right? The way that's historic, and think of things like Uber, like Lyft, like DoorDash, like Grubhub, right? These are sort of part-time or hourly gig work that you could pick up. Historically, people have gone to Quora or Reddit or Craigslist, right? In this sort of haphazardly organized way to see what's available. So what Steady has done is they've taken all of those opportunities and they've aggregated them and they've digitized them, and then allow you as an individual to figure out what's the best way for me to make money given where I live and my assets and my skill sets. And so it lets you, if you're a worker in St. Louis, be able to sign on and see, okay, here are the 15 jobs that I could get moving on today. And oh, by the way, my friend did one of these and really liked it. And so I've got some social validation that this could be a good fit for me. And they can provide all sorts of insights into those jobs. So a really interesting innovation focused on gig workers. There's obviously and soberingly been a surge in demand for those kinds of products after COVID hit, as folks are scrambling to look for new sources of income. And so their job board has been really helpful because everything is fresh and live. You know, if you go to other job boards, there's lots of links that are quite stale, right? So it's incredibly frustrating as a user because you're trying to figure out what can I do today, and everything is postings from 2 months ago. They've also been, I think, an interesting example of innovating for new pain points. So one of the things that they've rolled out is a telemedicine offering for their users in recognition that given shelter in place, a lot of folks are really struggling with, should I go into the doctor's office or not? So that's Steady. They're focused on gig workers and helping them to maximize their earning power and then sort of evolving that in real time based on COVID needs.
So I kind of want to transition a little bit here from specific companies to kind of impact investing as a whole. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I wanted to address was, since given all your portfolio companies are addressing a need or some sort of impact, is there a trade-off that you look at between value or impact and financial returns? If you could kind of walk us through your decision-making intuition and also what goes into your mind when you consider some of these companies for investments.
Yeah, it's a great question. And everybody in the field thinks about this differently. So I'll sort of share with you the Flourish philosophy and how we approach it. We are thesis-driven investors, right? So we have a thesis, which is that the smartphone, which puts this incredible computing power into everybody's pocket, can be used in order to reach more people at lower costs with better value propositions. And we think that can be really powerful, particularly for low and moderate income consumers, right? That is both a commercial thesis and an impact thesis. So almost by definition, we're saying upfront, we think the kinds of companies that we're going to get excited about are ones that generate positive value for our users. Once folks meet that screen, we are commercial return driven investors. So we, as we go through a diligence process, it would resemble anything you would expect to find out in Silicon Valley with more traditional mainstream venture investors, right? So a typical diligence process still very much includes analyzing what's the size of the total addressable market, right? Could we envision this being $1 billion plus market where this is a company that could really win? What does the competitive landscape look like? And do we think these guys or girls very differentiated vis-a-vis that? What are the financial forecasts? What are the positive unit economics? We run exit analysis on multiples on invested capital and on IRR. So we're going through a discipline of investing that I think is standard for the field overall. And we do have an eye towards generating return on our capital. I think where we may differ slightly is that we are fortunate to have a sole limited partner, which is Pierre Omidyar, right? So we don't take any external capital and are able to operate as an evergreen fund. And that gives us a little bit more patience and flexibility, both from a timeline perspective, which is particularly relevant when we're investing in liquid markets, like, for example, Tanzania, right? So in emerging markets, there isn't as mature of an exit culture as there is, for example, in the US, right? So that's an area where we might think about having a holding period that's longer than your typical venture holding period. It also gives us the flexibility for sometimes to think about addressable markets that might be smaller than one that meets the threshold for a typical venture capitalist. So for example, in the US, we've looked at startups that are trying to serve prisoners or ex-prisoners from a number of people and dollars involved that may not reach a threshold that could get a traditional venture capitalist excited. For us, the depth of the direct impact is so compelling that that's something that we would look at nonetheless. So at the highest level, we're looking at sets of businesses that we think almost by definition generate positive good because they're driving down costs and they're providing better services. And then against that, we're very much looking for commercial returns, in part because we want to encourage others to adopt this approach too, right? There's no world in which we, by ourselves, or even with our 5 closest impact investing friends, are going to independently change the capital markets, right? I think there's, over time, the goal here is to help folks realize this can actually be quite a compelling financial opportunity. And we're eager to see more folks join us in terms of applying an impact lens and having a point of view about the world they want to live in when they're doing their investing.
For sure. Thank you so much for that. And then I just want to open it up to the audience right now to see if anyone has any questions. You could either put it in the chat box or you could speak up.
This is the challenge in Zoom. It's much harder to tell when you're boring people to death. You know, in a room, you're like, oh, we're not hitting it here.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and please do, folks. I know it's with Zoom, it's always a little hard jumping in, but I wanted to ask you a question. A few years ago, I did a State Department trip on social entrepreneurship. I did some lectures in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Namibia. And, you know, these were local entrepreneurs with a social function. And what came up a lot, and I know the work that you do, as you described, both spans investing in for-profit companies and then making grants to organizations, that I think a number of entrepreneurs sort of struggle with that decision whether to set up shop as a not-for-profit and go for grants to support the work, or to set themselves up as a business. And I felt like actually a number of the entrepreneurs that I met on that trip in Southern Africa, because there was this growing amount of funding for businesses that were making an impact, like that everybody in the room was like, well, now I'm going to be a business. And I'm sort of curious, Sarah, like what advice do you have? And I know the context is different depending on the sector and where you are in the world, but I'm sure you get that question a lot about that decision point, and curious what perspective or advice you have for entrepreneurs that are making that initial decision how to structure their approach.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think something that folks wrestle with routinely, right? I don't have any, I think, you know, as you think about what makes for a venture investable company and laying out the different dimensions of sort of what has to be true, and then seeing, do I fit those boxes, right? So it's the formula of sort of, am I venture investable? It's am I playing in a market that $1 billion, use that as just a rule of thumb, right? But it's some size that if I think I can get 10% of that market, I could be a company that generates $100 million in revenue per year, right? You have to have some sight line to, it's a big enough opportunity and I could get a big enough bite of the apple that I could see a world where I'm a company that can generate X in revenue, right? It's really thinking through the unit economics. And when we say unit economics, it's, can I profitably serve one individual, right? Which means, what did it cost me to acquire that user? How long is that user going to stay engaged with me? for each year that they're engaged with me, what's my operating margin on it? And when I look at that equation, am I going to come out net positive? And, you know, the Valley can be a funky place because sometimes there's a lot of energy and investment that goes into companies where unit economics are not positive. But I think if you're in a position where you're trying to choose between a for-profit or a nonprofit structure, it's really important to play out those questions and feel comfortable that the answer is yes to all of those if you want to go down the venture route, because the venture route comes with expectations around what your future growth trajectory will be, right? There is an expectation that it has this kind of potential over a compressed time frame. So I think it's good to grapple with, is that what I want, right? And sometimes the answer may well be no, right? Because it is not the case that everything is best solved with a business. And so I think making sure that we don't over romanticize business as the answer to everything, right? There are ways in which commercial companies can make really positive contributions. And so we certainly want that to be part of our toolkit, but it's not the whole toolkit.
I'm just going to ask, a few people have their hands raised. Sissy Chen, do you have a question for Sarah?
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for telling us your story of your journey. So like I said, I'm a recent graduate and I'm like starting to get into the period of like thinking far ahead as of in the future. So in terms of making the career move, how did you know that it was the right time for you to make the career move, from consulting to investing, and how did you make the decision to go into investing, and what was the journey or thinking process behind that?
It's a great question. I suspect I'm in the same boat as a lot of people, where you can sort of concoct a cohesive storyline looking backwards about why you make the choices that you did. They don't necessarily represent what was actually going on, right? Which was a bunch of curly Q lines. I think I generally knew that I wanted to operate at the intersection of private and public markets, right? So that high level notion of there's a nexus there. I don't want to do just one and I don't want to do just the other. I want to do stuff that's drawing on both. That was something that at a nebulous level, I knew since I was little, right? In part inspired, I think, by my parents. It took a long time to figure out what that could look like from a professional standpoint, right? And I think the first insight was when I was at McKinsey and confirming, I really love private equity due diligences. I don't love not sleeping, but I really like the idea of tearing into a new market, understanding the potential there, trying to represent that via a financial model. What are the key variables? Can we stress test those? I found that incredibly exciting, right? But it was clear to me that alone without some mission orientation was probably not going to be satisfying long-term. And so I explored lots of different things. I mean, as I thought about what might come next after McKinsey, it took me a while to land on impact investing and the Omidyar network interpretation of impact investing against that. And I had conversations with tons and tons of generous, wonderful people, all of whom shared their life paths with me, and did a lot of interviews. I actually found that to be I learned a lot, right? Just by going and talking to companies and figuring out, do I like this culture? Do I not like this culture? Would I want to work here? Would I not want to work here? So there were a lot of sort of stumbles and fumbles in the 1 to 2 years that it took me to go from, I want to do something in finance and mission, to, let's move over to Omidyar network. The one, and Cece, this wasn't totally what you were teeing up, but in terms of career advice, if I had known that I was trying to be an impact investor, what would I have done differently? The one thing I do urge people to think about is going and getting operating experience at a startup. I think there's nothing that replaces having those chops, having walked the walk. I think it comes with a lot of credibility when you're an investor if you've been there and you know what it feels like to be on the opposite side of the table and have investors tear your deck apart, right? And try and do things on such an excruciating timeline. So even if investing is your end game, I actually think there are a lot of ways to get there, and doing it on the ground is one really good one.
Thank you so much. John has a question. Do you want to speak up, John?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks. Thank you, Sarah, for doing this. Really appreciate it. I was particularly interested in kind of one of your first statements in your career path.
Oh, I think we lost you, John.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. I probably accidentally tapped it,
No
the mute
problem.
button there. But I guess I'll just restate it because I'm not sure where I cut out. But I was really interested in your kind of first part of your career path there, Sarah, where you said you were interested in first going to law school, but decided because of, I guess, like the geoclimate and with the rise of China to not end up pursuing that path. I would presume that some of the reasons why you were interested in law have still pervaded into your career now. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you think your career path would have changed had you actually ended up going to law school? What kind of aspects do you still see that you were interested in at law school, still in your current career as a venture capitalist?
Okay, that's existential. See, this is the fear whenever you do this kind of thing. Folks are like, did you make the right choices? And you're like, I have no idea.
Well, there's no one right choice. That's the best part of it.
No. It's actually a really good question. And I find in venture that I'm very drawn to governance, that's a space where I've spent a lot of time reading independently and learning independently and going to seminars. And I mean, right. So the great thing about life is you can learn in so many different ways. And so even though I skipped over law school, there are still opportunities to sort of gain knowledge around that area as it pertains to the space that I have ended up operating in. I don't know if, John, the question more broadly was sort of the benefits of a law degree in a venture context.
No, I guess kind of, I would be interested in that, but more so it's just, how did your interest shape that? I know you mentioned just previously, you kind of kept hitting on all the questions I was going to ask, so I had to keep switching it, but you suggested, being involved in the startup and the operations aspect of that, so where along your career path would you have suggested doing that? Do you wish at McKinsey, for example, you had started or tried to become involved more with some of the earlier stage companies? Would you have wanted to branch out and completely go into that before going to the venture capital world, or possibly even before the MBA experience, I guess even?
Yeah. So where would you have fit sort of operational exposure into the career path? Moments I could have thought about that, even in business school, there are lots of chances to go work with a local community startup or to do a summer internship. I think is a really great way to get a taste for it and see, is this something I'm drawn to or not? So both of those I think would be terrific opportunities. And then all of this is serendipity. And at some level, just sort of opportunity and luck, right? It's just continuing to circle around the things that get you excited, reaching out and building your network, and then waiting to see when something strikes. And I actually think that's particularly true within the quote unquote impact investing world, because it is relatively small. And so at any given moment in time, there isn't always, it's not going to work at an iBank or consulting where there's sort of this well-regimented recruiting schedule and how to go about trying to get that job. This is much more a space where it's about planting seeds over a long period of time, cultivating a lot of relationships, getting as much exposure and experience as you can, and then sort of seeing where the world takes you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to Howard has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but I think you made a reference to your impact investing friends. What is your investment model, do you lead and take on impact investing co-investors? Do you follow along with a lead impact investing co-investor? Do you always invest with co-investors, never invest with co-investors? How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, great question. So in many ways, we're just an early stage venture shop. That's how we operate. So we can be quite flexible from a syndicate standpoint. We both lead and we co-invest. If I think about the 6 deals that we've done over the last couple of quarters, we led some of them, we co-invested in others. It's very specific to the company and frankly, their syndicate preferences, right? I mean, ultimately our goal is to set up any startup for success. And so early days, we're always having conversations with entrepreneurs about what are you looking for? What is the syndicate and set of voices around the table that best positions you guys to be successful? But the short answer is we lead, we co-invest. Our ticket sizes can range from $500K at the low end when we're investing in a seed deal up to sort of 6 to 8 million at the high end if we're doing an A or a B. And we often co-invest with commercial mainstream investors, right? So if you think about some of the companies we talked through together today, Propel, which focuses on food stamp recipients, Andreessen Horowitz led that seed round. Kleiner Perkins came in on the A. Steady, we're in with a number of corporate venture, so Propel Ventures, and the list goes on. So if you looked at any one of our syndicates, it tends to be a mix of sort of mainstream commercial VC and some impact investors. For what it's worth, when we have conversations with entrepreneurs, we don't self-define as an impact investing shop. It's very much, we are mission-driven fintech investors. So we're looking for those companies where the entrepreneur, him or herself, is very motivated to try and achieve something positive for low and moderate income consumers, and where the revenue and operating model and KPIs align with good outcomes for consumers. So that's how we think about that.
Great.
And I thought you were going to ask me, did I learn everything I know about life from my father? And the answer would be yes. And I want you guys to report back to Mark Morgenstern. That was Sarah's.
I'm going to move on to Anna. She has a question. Anna, do you want to speak up? I can just
read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just ask it for her. So her question is, could you talk about your work with nonprofits? Is there a difference with foundation funding?
Yeah, I would love to. So we skipped over that before, right? I shared our work with Propel, with Steady. I can tell you guys about some of our other for-profits. On the nonprofit side, I'll give you an example of each of the ways we use our nonprofits dollars. So one is for research. So an example there is we funded a book called with others, the U.S. Financial Diaries. And what they did was they chose 235 low and moderate income families. And over the course of the year, they tracked every dollar in and every dollar out for each one of those families in sort of anthropological discussions in order to surface the financial challenges and coping mechanisms of low and moderate income households in the U.S., right? And what that yielded was a recognition that income volatility, not just year over year, but month over month, was a growing challenge and source of chronic financial stress for U.S. households. If you look at some of the macro trends over the last 40 years, one of them has been this shift more towards a contingent workforce, where your hours on a month-over-month basis are less consistent and predictable, right? So think of a barista at Starbucks that might have sort of 20 hours one week and 15 hours the next week. And the ripple effects of that change in the labor markets are pretty profound for people's financial lives. So that book, which helped to crystallize that insight, that monthly income volatility is mucking up families' abilities to budget and plan and get ahead and build emergency savings, has informed a lot of the companies. It informs our investment theses, right? It's part of the reason we got excited about a company like Chime, which is a fee-free mobile banking leader in the US that helps their consumers to save, right? So we look for for-profits that are addressing some of the issues that arise via the nonprofit grants we make. Another example of how we use our nonprofit dollars is to promote regulatory modernization and innovation and dialogue between for-profit innovators and regulators. And so we help to seed fund a nonprofit called the FinReg Lab. And what they do is every year they choose a topic that regulators are keen to learn more about, and where startups want to share some insights about what they're seeing, right? You can imagine if you're a financial regulator or policymaker, fintech, financial services, and technology have been evolving at just a truly ferocious pace over the last 10 years. There is so much changing. And it's not easy to stay abreast of what's happening and to regulate and make good policy against that. So the topic that FinReg Lab chose this first year was the notion of using alternative data in order to do credit underwriting. And the context there is, when you go to get a loan, historically in the US, we're very reliant on your FICO score. The FICO is king. That's sort of what shows, are you credit worthy or not, right? But there's actually other data that can be an equally potent signal of whether you're credit worthy or not that we historically haven't used, and that could have inclusive potential. And specifically checking account. So if you look at what's in the money moving in and out of somebody's checking account, that can actually tell you some interesting things about their creditworthiness. So FinReg Lab had a bunch of startups, well-known financial service startups, all participate and contribute their data. And they wrote a report that shared out the inclusive potential of looking at alternative data. And regulators subsequently, in part informed by this work, have decided to create a structure to allow that kind of innovation to occur. So that's another example of sort of how you're piecing together lots of different stakeholders in order to deepen an evidence base so that you can unlock greater for-profit innovation, right? So we are always looking for the connections between the for-profit world and the nonprofit world. They're not these sort of separate spheres for us. They talk to one another quite deliberately.
Thank you so much. So we'll try to get one more question in from Matthew Chang. Are you here? All right, let me just read it. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. So regarding the bit of advice you had about investors working at startup companies to sort of get a feel of what they have to deal with when they're dealing with investors, would you recommend the same? And if so, why or why not? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So even more broadly, I think we get asked sort of, what's your advice for becoming an impact investor, right? And I think the advice against that is to draw lots of concentric circles of things that help you build expertise and insights and relevance in impact investing, and that there are lots of different ways to do that. So being an investor is certainly one way to prepare yourself, right? Many folks in impact investing came out of investment banking. Consulting, I think, gives you a certain set of skills, particularly around analyzing business models and in the face of ambiguity, which venture is chock full of, right? Because remember, a lot of times we're investing in companies, they may be pre-revenue, they may even be pre-product, right? So you're really having to extrapolate. So consulting can help to build your skill sets there. And then being an operator is another way to be a part of this world and to start to gain currency. And so I don't think there's one is not more right than the other, but as you think about what you're exploring, I think keeping a broader possibility set just gives you more opportunities. So would just encourage folks not to be too narrow in terms of how they explore what it might mean to get involved with impact investing.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to start wrapping up here because we're about to be a little short on time. So in terms of for my final question, I wanted to ask you, you've gone through such an immense leadership journey, and I'm sure there's been several struggles along the way. How have you managed to retain yourself in your leadership style, but also what was that one kind of sort of experience or moment where it was a great teaching lesson in terms of leadership for you?
That's a wonderful question. I think the thing I've had to get better at generally is flexibility and uncertainty. So the venture world is very unpredictable and the churn is constant. And I think when I first got into venture, the recognition that like every startup is a roller coaster, everyone. Even the squares and the stripes, no matter how the story gets written, everybody had bumps along the way. And so you just have to start to take that as part and parcel with the role. And so I've had to evolve and mature as somebody who gets like, bumps are par for the course. That's just how this thing rolls. And so if you don't want the bumps, then you got to get out of the game. And you know, everybody's wired differently. So for me, as somebody who likes things that are structured and predictable, and I know what's coming next, leaning into a world where it's like, you don't know what text message you're going to get and what the next challenge you're going to need to live brainstorm with a CEO is. But that's the fun of this, right? That is the joy of being in venture. That was sort of a transition, personal transition for me over the last couple of years.
Thank you so much. I think this whole session has definitely been very insightful for not just impact investing, but also as a leadership and a leader as a whole. So thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much to everyone. I'm going to turn it back to Professor Goldberg right now.
Great. Aditi, thank you so much for moderating. That was awesome. You did a great job. Sarah, thank you for joining. I do look forward when this all settles and we get back to traveling, and I know you come home to see your family often, so hope to get you onto campus and engaging with students and doing more in your hometown, particularly without Cleveland sports at the moment. There's, figure out something to do with our time. So, but thank you for doing this today, Sarah. That's great.
Well, thank you guys for the wonderful questions. It was really wonderful to join you. I so appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
I love getting to be with Clevelanders.
Cleveland.
Okay, great.
Hello, Cleveland. So let me just do a little administrative promos for next week. Actually, Sarah, you may enjoy going to come back next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. So a colleague in our Department of History, John Grubowski, who is really the foremost expert on Cleveland. Oh, sorry. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I think my Facebook audio was out there. John Grabowski is going to do a session on looking at the history of entrepreneurship in Cleveland. So as many of us who are here know, 100 years ago with John Rockefeller and other leading entrepreneurs, we were really at the center of kind of economic life, and things have changed over time. So John's going to share kind of a historical journey. And actually one of the things, Sarah, and I think I'll be curious your perspective on this, one of the things at this moment, particularly mid this crisis, is, with Facebook and Twitter and other companies announcing that they're going to allow their workers to be anywhere. Is this the moment for Cleveland? Mm-hmm. So I know your parents would like that, but is this the moment that we get folks to come back here?
That's a dangerous seed that you just planted there, Professor Goldberg. That was an unfair little twist at the end.
I know. So we'll talk about kind of Cleveland's history and entrepreneurship, and talk about kind of some of the things that we're facing now. So that'll be on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. And then another former Clevelander, Will Lewis, who actually is recently joining our board of directors here in Cleveland. He's the chairman and CEO of Insmed, which is a publicly traded biotech company. So he'll be with us on Wednesday, and that's also at 1 o'clock in conversation, talking about healthcare and COVID and his perspective. So that'll be great. So we've got 2 events next week, and hope you can join. And again, Sarah and Aditi, thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for everybody who joined us today.